In a whisper of the wind that passes through the ancient ruins, and in he murmur of the vibrating markets alive, Mexico reveals itself as a living canvas of epics and legends. Every stone carved by ancient hands, every murmur of daily life, and every sacrifice to the sun preserves fragments of an identity woven with threads of fire and resistance. This narrative delves into the beating heart of a land that, beyond the history books, holds secrets of forgotten heroes, of cultures that raised temples to the sky, and of cities that emerged between the water and mud. Through 15 thematic episodes, the viewer will witness a sensory journey that blurs the boundaries of the time. From the fog that envelops the mountains from the Gulf to the calm waters of Lake Texcoco, each chapter will give breath to the greatness of empires that forged your destiny with sweat, ingenuity, and devotion. Prepare to feel the greatness of those civilizations like never before. An epic tale that teaches, moves, and inspires. A deep murmur resounds under the jungle of Veracruz and Tabasco, where the Olmec civilization raised its colossal basalt heads. Those gigantic sculptures, with enigmatic features and expressions imperturbable, they seem to be watching over the origin same as the history. There, under the blazing sun, the early priests carved calendars and sketched symbols that would shape the oldest writing in Mesoamerica. Between swamps and a fast-flowing river, the society development complexes religious rituals that were performed homage to deities of the rain, the jaguar, and the corn. The Olmec people believed that the earth was renewed with each cosmic cycle, and its ceremonies were looking to appease powerful spirits that ruled the fortune of the harvest. In amidst drums and chants, the priests wore plumes of exotic birds and used obsidian mirrors for communication with the underworld. Daily life took place between the hunting, fishing, and agriculture, while specialized artisans molded ceramics with fine reliefs and jade pearls. Each piece was a testimony of the harmony between the man and the nature, reflecting in his engravings the fertility of the land and the strength of the ancestors. In his cozy adobe semicircle, the families they shared stories by torchlight, preserving an oral legacy that today arrives crossing centuries. Not very far away, the circular city of Cuicuilco emerged on a hill covered in ash volcanic. Its truncated pyramid stood as a beacon of civilization, a religious center where ether and stone were melted in a same altar. Architects visionaries, they laid out curvilinear avenues and squares that served as a stage for offerings and pilgrimages under a darling star dotted. To the south, the Zapotecs of Monte Alban carved his own firmament of tombs and altars, crossing mountains to erect palaces and prototypes of glyphic writing. In each grave, offerings of shells, polychrome pottery, and clay masks narrated stories of kings, warriors, and astronomer priests. That plateau dominated the Valley of Oaxaca, becoming an observatory that aligned temples with the solstices and equinoxes. The exchange between these primitive cultures sowed the bases of a common trunk: the corn, obsidian, ball game, and the myths about its origin of the time. Under skies iridescent, merchants traveled ceremonial routes with cocoa pots and dyed blankets with cochineal, weaving networks of influence that would endure millennia. But this was just the beginning. On the banks of a valley surrounded by volcanoes rises the colossal silhouette of Teotihuacan, a metropolis whose authorship remains shrouded in mystery. Its gigantic pyramids rise like stone planets, oriented with astronomical precision to capture the sunrise in the equinox. Streets and central avenues lead to the heart of the city, where the Temple of the Feathered Serpent stands as a silent witness to initiation rites. Polychrome mural paintings adorn the temple, cameras underground, showing priests wearing jaguar masks and musicians playing seashell instruments. The vast population estimated at more than 100,000 inhabitants, lived together in neighborhoods multilingual and multicultural. Merchants from the land of the Gulf and the North exchanged obsidian, ceramics, and salt, while specialized artisans produced figurines and votive sculptures of great finesse. Anonymous engineers designed a drainage system that prevented floods, and built residences with murals that narrated stories of agricultural and warrior deities. Each home was a microcosm, adorned with vessels, rituals, and jade vessels that symbolized the earthly abundance. The decline of Teotihuacan seems woven with multiple threads: internal tensions, agricultural crises, and possibly urban rebellions that led to the sacking of palaces. The flames they left scars on ancient walls before their inhabitants disappeared, leaving behind him a skeleton of streets deserted. Today, after centuries of abandonment, Teotihuacan resounds with the echo of processions invisible and the beating of a past that refuses to fade away. Visitors walking along the Causeway of the Dead feel the greatness of an empire that, in your silence, still whispers secrets of power and transcendence. But what was to come after? I would change everything. In the peninsula that today divides the Gulf of the Caribbean, flourished the Mayans as prodigious astronomers and architects. Their cities rose between the jungle, where the pyramidal temples they emerge as petrified witnesses of prodigious knowledge. Every city-state, from Tikal to Palenque, had his own lineage of divinity rulers. In hidden chambers of palaces, scribes recorded in codices stories of wars, alliances, and coronation rituals, tracing genealogies with soot ink and natural pigments. Celestial observatories allowed the Mayans build accurate calendars, amazing, where the counting days and lunar cycles were intertwined with planting and harvesting ceremonies. The sacred cenote of Chichen Itza served as a mirror to the sky and was the scene of offerings and sacrifices that sought appease Chak, god of rain. Sculptors carved stelae that narrated conquests and the rise of kings such as Jasau Chankawil, whose victories were celebrated with dances and cacao banquets. Polychrome stucco covered walls and columns, depicting scenes of human sacrifice and dances warriors under Quetzal crowns. Mayan mathematics introduced the concept of zero, a sacred void that represented the primordial abyss from which all creation sprang. Knowing the magnitude of eclipses and trajectories planetary, astronomers could predict celestial events decades in advance. When splendor reached his zenith, some decaying cities began to be abandoned, victims perhaps from prolonged droughts or internal conflicts. Today, the jungle is slowly reclaiming those temples, showing that even the firmest stone can succumb to the embrace of the nature. Mayan legacy lives on in descendants who still they speak languages ancestral and celebrate Hi-Aha calendar with fire and corn festivals. But the history still I had more chapters to write. From the steppes, Mexican nomads arrived from the north in search of the divine sign, an eagle devouring a snake on a nopal. That one sacred vision to them Indian he cite, where they would found Tenochtitlan, a city that would rise on the mirror of a lake. Engineers and bricklayers they built chinampas floating, artificial islands of fertile land on the water, where corn and squash tubes grew. Causes and dams connected the city with the riverbank, while aqueducts, they were wearing water cleans palaces and temples. Weekly markets were a burst of colors and aromas. Exotic birds, cocoa in grains, embroidered blankets, and copper crafts. Merchants from Texcoco and Tlacopan. They exchanged tributes from regions distant, weaving the network that would support the empire. The Triple Alliance cemented his power through military pacts and dynastic marriages. Moctezuma, Ilhuicamina, and Ahuizotl expanded the borders of the city-state, forcing the town's neighbors to pay tribute in gold, corn, and prisoners of war. Ritual life was marked by sacrifices bloody in the Great Temple, where the Popocatépetl volcano and the mountain Iztaccíhuatl they observed in silence. Every drop of blood shed was an offering to Huitzilopochtli, the solar god who demanded the lifeblood of humans to sustain themselves in his cosmic journey. In the palaces royal, scribes recorded the genealogy of emperors and the feats warriors, carving pictograms that today feed the imaginary of colonial chronicles. Tenochtitlan was a beacon of power, prosperity, and mystery that amazed both locals and foreigners. But the rage from the outside world would accelerate your destiny. In 1519, a fleet of white ships grooved the horizon, and on its decks men were seen with shining armor and horses unknown. Hernán Cortés stepped on land Aztec, carrying with him the fire of a conquest that would shine in stories of glory and horror. At first, the Mexicans welcomed visitors with offerings of jugs of pulque and quetzal feathers, believing that they fulfilled the prophecy of the return of Quetzalcoatl. Moctezuma received Cortés in a palace adorned with eagle and jaguar banners. Without suspect, dark purpose, they hid those men. The alliance with Tlaxcalans and others towns subjugated provided Cortés with warriors, local, and knowledge of the terrain. With tactics and treachery, he managed to capture Moctezuma, attracting the fury of the city that shortly after exploded in rebellion after the massacre in the Great Temple. The Pitud ay Fuerte, sad night, saw the Spanish flee under the rain of arrows and spears, losing much of its army in a labyrinth of chinampas. However, the smallpox and famine decimated the indigenous population during the final siege, turning the endurance in a tragic echo. In August 1521, Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, surrendered his spear before Cortés. Those sacred stones that once echoed with songs of war, they fell silent, and on their ruins, the Mexico City, new capital of the Empire, Spanish. The end of the empire. Mexican frame the dawn of a new world, a fusion of cultures, languages, and beliefs that would give origin to the Mexican identity. But it was just beginning an unexpected chapter. The morning wake-up in the newly founded Mexico City, laid out with streets, straight lines, and imposing plazas on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. On the banks of the ancient lake, the Spanish crown erects the Viceroyalty of New Spain, an ensemble of institutions that disseminate the royal justice, tribute, and encomienda. Officials and conquistadors, dressed in cloaks and polished armor, stroll under the shade of newly built Mudejar bell towers, while the missionaries rush to build churches that compete with the sun for their place in the colonial firmament. Under that new grammar of power, a caste system emerges that seeks to classify the population according to his origin and purity of blood. Peninsulars and Creoles dispute privileges in the mines and haciendas. Mestizos, indigenous people, and Africans fight for a space in the commission and in the market. Despite the prohibitions, the traditions ancient survive in syncretic celebrations, where dances pre-Hispanic and songs in Nahuatl live together with litanies in Latin and lit candles. The colonial economy is based on the silver from Zacatecas and gold from Guanajuato, extracted with rigor in his sinkhole and moved in galleons towards Seville. Indigenous men and women, forced into incessant labor, find refuge of hope in the holiday of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who converts as a symbol of resistance and popular devotion. The convents, shelter for anonymous artists, house mutilated codices and profuse altarpieces where the miscegenation is reflected in brown faces and bearded angels. Baroque literature flourishes in Flor, New Spain, with the pens of chroniclers such as Bernal Díaz del Castillo and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who challenges the rules of the cloister in verses that exhale ingenuity and passion. In the halls of Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, gatherings lit by oil lamps discuss natural law and the limits of the crown, prefiguring the ideas of freedom that will germinate ages after. However, underground tensions are building up. In the depths of a fragmented society, indigenous rebellions, escapes of African slaves, and disagreements between Creoles and peninsular officials weave a tapestry of intrigue. The myths of insurgency, fueled by the voices of clandestine prophets, awaken echoes of emancipation in valleys and mountains, prelude to an inevitable breakup. In the squares, the bustle of merchants intersperses words in Spanish, Nahuatl, and African languages, forging a hybrid identity that the time will consolidate as Mexican. The flavors of the cocoa, the corn and chili combine with spices foreigners, illuminating a gastronomic fusion that transcends the palate and takes over of the spirit. But this cultural amalgamation was just beginning to simmer. In kitchens trembling and secret gatherings begin to take shape ideas of freedom inspired by the Atlantic revolutions. Books prohibited circulate in travelers, suitcases, and in chests of conspirators, awakening the enlightened spark among Creoles educated. In the capital, women and men of the elite begin to question a peninsular domain, whispering passages from Rousseau and Voltaire while caress their leather notebooks. The gloomy valley of Hidalgo y Costilla go be born a feverish priest who, with a resonant voice, calls the people to rise up against the royal yoke. The cry breaks out in the early morning of September 16, 1810, shaking churches and farms to the beat of improvised drums. Peasants, artisans, and miners join the call, armed with sickles and rifles rudimentary, determined to conquer the emancipation that they themselves write with blood. The first battles resonate in Dolores and Valladolid, where the muddy ground absorbs the echo of bullets and cries of freedom. Anonymous heroines weave bandages and hospitalize patients, wounded under thatched roofs, while improvised poets recite insurgent verses that encourage the cause. Popular fervor spreads throughout Guanajuato and Zacatecas, where mines and haciendas they pay tribute to the new tricolor flag. However, the dream of the independence is seen clouded by the repression vice-regal. Bodies hang from poles in public squares, and the chieftains struggle to maintain the cohesion of a motion fractured. Ideals and ambitions blend, and the shadow of the betrayal looms when some insurgent leaders negotiate with ancient enemies. The entry of Napoleonic troops into Spain weakens the authority of the crown, and moderate Creoles demand constitutional reforms instead of a total rupture. In Cadiz, a Magna Carta is promulgated that reverberates until the south of the Atlantic, putting pressure on those who they look for full independence. Meanwhile, in the south, guerrillas mestizos lead harassment in roads and mountains, demonstrating the power of guerrilla warfare and the knowledge of the land. His successes inspire a feeling of national unity, and the countryside becomes entrenched, where the hope beats with renewed strength. But still was missing a leader who would articulate all those fragments of freedom. In half, from the tumult, a figure with a serene countenance and a will of steel emerges. Agustín de Iturbide. With cunning, he makes a pact with Vicente Guerrero, a mestizo insurgent of firm convictions, and they seal the Iguala Plan, germ of independent Mexico. The banner waving in the wind fuses colors and promises: religion, independence, and unity. Three guarantees that aspire to consolidate a new destination. The royalist troops, tired from years of conflict and infected by the fatigue of the empire, begin to desert. Iturbide tours villas and estates, seducing peninsular officers with promises of forgiveness and privileges, while warriors of all castes gather under the tricolor emblem. The roar of the marches in Iguala and Acatempan announces the fall of the old domination. September 27, 1821, in the Mexico City, Iturbide parades triumphantly, A euphoric crowd greets the end of the Hispanic domination and celebrates with dances and corridos that run through the corners of the nascent country. The Archbishop crowns the new flag, and are recited the first decrees of the independence, wording that will seal centuries of longings. But the cohesion cracks when arises the struggle over the form of government. Moderate monarchists, federalists, and centralists clash in passionate debates, threatening the stability of the newly liberated country. In the gloom of palaces and halls, intrigues are woven to crown kings or proclaim republics, while people watch expectantly. Iturbide, proclaimed emperor with name of Eagle, discovers that the throne is a taut wire, unable to hold the contradictions of a diverse nation. The emperor abdicated in 1823 before the pressure from Republican factions, opening step to a Congress constituent that drafts the first Magna Carta of Mexico. With this is consummated independence, but a more complex reality is born: the construction of the national identity. Citizens of all roots dress in tricolor to claim a country that is still searching for its own soul. However, the journey toward the consolidation was just beginning. The young republic faces the challenge of governing a territory immense and diverse. Rifles and cannons still resonate in mountains and valleys, while factions confront opposing visions. Federalists who defend the state autonomy, and centralists who advocate a unified power. In the halls of the National Palace, the words, "They collide like shrapnel," undermining any attempt at lasting peace. The empty coffers and the war debts force resorting to loans foreigners and the sale of goods nationals. Officials take up positions with the sword in one hand and the official seal in the another, while gangs of bandits and warlords they loot roads and towns, mining the trust in his central government. In 1836, Texas declares its independence, marking the first of a series of fractures territorial. Next, the annexation of the United States to that territory precipitated the War of 1846, where unequal armies fought battles that will stain the city with gunpowder and morning border. Children and the elderly they flee along paths dusty, and the Rio Bravo becomes in line of blood and joy. The transfer of vast areas, embodied in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, redefines the geographic limits of Mexico and leaves scars that will last in the national imagination. The loss of California, New Mexico, and other provinces wake up deep reflections on the destiny of a nation young and wounded. Meanwhile, in the center, liberals and conservatives fight his own political conflict. Riots in the Mexico City, coups and sieges of the National Palace continue with alarming constancy. The roar of cannons and guns coexists with the roar of printing presses, distributing newspapers of conflicting ideas. In middle of the uncertainty, cultural initiatives emerge. The Mexican Railway traces its first rails, sculptors create the Statue of Liberty, and painters capture the greatness of the national landscape. The arts emerge as a critical and hopeful mirror, revealing the longing for a society that seeks to define itself. But among the chaos, a glimpse is made longing for reconstruction. With a passage of the years, Benito Juárez embodies the desire to modernize and secularize the country. Its reform laws separate the clergy of the state, and they disentail ecclesiastical property, causing tensions with the conservatives and the Catholic Church. The country is entering a crossroads between tradition and progress, discussing the meaning of the popular sovereignty. The civil confrontation leads to the Reform War, 1857 to 1861, a fratricidal conflict that drags villages and cities under its control shrapnel hammer. Juárez, refugee in the north, organizes an itinerant government that fights to implement the Constitution of 1857, while European eyes were focused on Mexico's potential. The French intervention, 1862, brings with it the Maximilian of Habsburg's usurpation as a puppet emperor, and the country is the scene of an international war. Guillermo Miramon and Tomas Mejia defend the empire with fervor, while the Republican troops of Juarez and Porfirio Diaz fight decisive skirmishes. The fall of Maximilian in 1867 and his shooting in Querétaro, they symbolize the triumph of the Republic and the doctrine Juarez Papri Mexico, again independent. It is affirmed under the slogan of justice and equality before the law. The country begins a period of political and economic reconstruction, with emphasis in the public education and separation church-state. The restoration of the Republic paves the way for the Porfirian era, where the progress it advances at the pace of telegraph lines and fledgling factories. However, it is beginning to be noticed the gap between oligarchy and peasantry, prelude to the Great Revolutionary Shock. Meanwhile, the seed of the modernity germinates in ports, railways, and universities. Intellectuals and businessmen rub shoulders. In salons of aristocrats, dreaming with a prosperous Mexico, integrated into the global market. But latent social tensions foreshadowed the next big one seizure. In the dawn of 1910, the whispers of discontent circulate estates and towns. The landowner imposes miserable wages, and the peasant yearns land to be cultivated. Francisco Torre Madero, with a conciliatory voice, calls for the rebellion from San Luis, igniting the fuse of a revolt that will shake the foundations of the country. Shortly after, Emiliano Zapata rises the banner of land and liberty in Morelos, and Pancho Villa extends its steel shadow to the north. Every battle is stained with gunpowder and mud. Peasants armed with old shotguns face the federal cavalry under overcast skies. Between makeshift trenches, nurses and neighbors improvise field hospitals, sewing wounds with faded fabrics and hope burning. The corridos are woven around bonfires, recounting the exploits of leaders who promise redemption and justice. Meanwhile, the Mexico City vibrates with rumors of strikes, workers, and student protests. Women, brave people, join the movement, weaving support networks that bring medicines and food to combat zones. Their names, barely a whisper in the wind, turn whispers in slogans. The revolution is not only about rifles, but about ideals of equality. The overthrow of Porfirio Diaz in 1911 gave way to successive governments unstable. Victoriano Huerta, betraying the promise Maderista, establishes a dictatorship bloody that faces the fierce resistance of Venustiano Carranza and Álvaro Obregón. On every corner, old chieftains forge alliances and break pacts, triggering purges and political chaos. The Aguascalientes conventions, they try to unify opposing visions, but tensions are translated in new battlefronts. Zapata rejects government mandates and continues his fight for agrarian reform, while Villa marches towards the citadel, determined to impose revolutionary power. The country is fragmented between ideals and ambitions, and the weapons roar without truce. With the Carranza's victory and the promulgation of the Constitution of 1917 are enshrined rights social and the land expropriation. The role of agrarian reform is expanding, opening a new chapter for peasants yearning for possession. However, the cracks persist. Dark corruption and new chiefdoms emerge under the shadow of the law. The lament of a nation wound mixes with the hope for reconstruction. But still, were left wounds to heal and memories to honor. The next stage would mark the cultural rebirth. Church ruins and hacienda beams. A new one emerges artistic movement that demands the walls of palaces and schools. Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. They wield paintbrushes as banners of social justice. Their vast and colorful murals narrate the epic of the town worker from the conquest to the revolution. Each stroke vindicates the worker, the peasant, and the indigenous. In the Secretary of Public Education, Rivera paints scenes of workers carving the progress, while Siqueiros explores the dynamism of form in murals that vibrate with force almost cinematic. Orozco, in contrast, pours out all the human tragedy, twisted figures, and apocalyptic shadows that describe the fragility of being. Artists travel to schools and workshops, teaching techniques and training disciples. Art ceases to be an elitist luxury to become in a language collective, accessible to all. The people contemplate their own stories, reflected in bright colors, feeling like the protagonist in the construction of a renewed national identity. The House of the World Worker and emerging unions inspire messages of unity, captured on factory walls and squares central. In every city, old mansions are transformed in open-air galleries, promoting political and cultural debate. Art breaks with academicism and embraces the street, provoking reactions that range from euphoria to controversy. At the same time, literature flourishes in realist and revolutionary currents. Ramon Lopez Velarde, Martín Luis Guzmán, and Nelly Campobello portray the human landscapes of the post-war, while muralists and poets dialogue in the capital's cafes and lounges. The fusion literary feeds on the Castilian and the indigenous languages, creating voices, news that resonate with strength and sensitivity. Mexican cinema, emerging and bold, begins to film in colonial interiors and settings rural. Ethnographic documentaries record dances traditional and rituals ceremonial, preserving for the posterity the pulse of a town that is reborn. The camera, like the brush, becomes in memory instrument collective. Creation boosts national self-esteem and projects a renewed image of Mexico to the world. But while art celebrated the unity, social and political tensions continued brewing after Backstage. From the 1940s to the 1970s, Mexico experienced a dizzying economic growth known as the Mexican Miracle. Industrial plants rise in Monterrey and the Valley of Mexico, manufacturing cars, machinery, and textiles that supply global markets. Truck caravans cross roads newly paved, carrying progress and hope. The import substitution model promotes the local production of previously imported goods. The automotive industry flourishes with factories of origin foreign and cheap labor, attracting investment and boosting the economy. In working-class neighborhoods, generations whole find employment stable, the families aspire to the education university, and the dream of the social mobility. The power grid is expanding, and the water service potable reaches rural areas. Radios and televisions broadcast news of medical advances, Hollywood movies, and emerging soap operas. The urban population is growing rapidly, and multifamily buildings appear in ancient pastures. However, the growth entails imbalances. The concentration of wealth in elites' industrial and political leaves, peasants and poorly paid workers are left behind. The environment is beginning to suffer. Polluted rivers, deforested forests, and smog in the Mexico City warns about the consequences of the poorly managed progress. Intellectuals and students warn about the urgency of social reforms. In the National Autonomous University of Mexico, seminars and events, they ask elderly stake citizen and labor justice. The emergence of awareness that the development, it must be inclusive and sustainable, not just a numerical indicator of production. Meanwhile, the modern architecture leaves his fingerprint in museums, universities, and bus stations. Architects like Luis Barragan combine avant-garde lines with traditional colors, creating bright spaces that seek harmony between modernity and Mexican roots. Urban aesthetics are transformed, reflecting a nation in transit. The Mexican Miracle illuminated the hope of millions, but also raised alarms about inequality and limitations structural. In the horizon, new movements social were peeking out the head, ready to demand voice and justice. In the 60s and 70s, the streets of Mexico rumble with student slogans. On October 2, 1968, the Plaza de las Three Cultures is tinged with bullets and calls for democracy. Young people marched demanding freedom of expression and the end of repression. The echo of that event spreads like a wound open in the national consciousness. At the same time, indigenous communities organize assemblies to demand rights, territorial and cultural preservation. Leaderships, such as that of the Civic Democratic Unity, emerges in Oaxaca and Chiapas, articulating demands for autonomy, bilingualism, and social justice. Roots ancestral, they claim your place in the Republic. In 1994, the lifting of the EZLN in Chiapas puts the international spotlight on the historical inequality. With faces, cutlery, and rifles in hand, Zapatista peasants proclaim global justice and demand fulfillment of promises unfulfilled since the revolution. The caracols and autonomous juntas build an alternative form of organization community. Feminist movements charge force, denouncing gender violence and workplace discrimination. Marches and forums demand the reform of laws and the respect for the physical integrity of the women. Poets and artists translate his fight in murals and performances, making of the body female a canvas of protest and empowerment. Civil society expands. NGOs, LGBTIQ+ groups, and environmental groups join the public discussion. Awareness campaigns, they carry issues such as climate change and the defense of Mexican Amazon to stages global. Connected citizens demand transparency and accountability to its rulers. The democratic transition of 2000 marks the peaceful transfer of power, leaving behind the monopoly of a single party. Political alternation raises expectations of renewal, but the ghosts of corruption and the violent structural persist. Between hopes and disappointments, the Mexican society continues his search for equity. These movements, they have woven a web of resistance and vindication that beats in every corner of the country. But the history contemporary still deploys new chapters. In the 21st century fears, Mexico emerges in he global scenario with diverse voices, award-winning filmmakers, groundbreaking scientists, borders, and indigenous communities that revitalize their languages. The country beats with a renewed pulse, combining cutting-edge technology with traditions ancestral. The cities rise in glass skyscrapers, while in remote villages, the party's employers' associations keep the collective memory alive. Entrepreneurs create social impact startups, connecting local markets with international platforms. Mexican creativity is projected in urban murals, food festivals, and craft fairs. Social networks allow the organization of mobilizations, snapshots, and the digital activism amplifies causes such as the defense of Sierra Gorda or the search for missing persons. Connected generations break barriers, mixing Tic-Dan-Zon talks with crowdfunding campaigns to rebuild schools. The challenge of century is to balance the development with the care of the environment. National parks and marine reserves fight against the excessive exploitation. Energy projects, clean and sustainable agriculture sprout as oases of innovation in the desert of the modernity. The Mexican diaspora extends his influence in the foreigner, carrying flavors, rhythms, and living words. Migrants build bridges cultural that redefine the identity. No matter how far away, Mexico always beats in the heart of its people, which exports music, cinema, literature, and hope. Although persist security and inequality challenges, the national resilience translates in solidarity. In times of crisis, bits of humanity flourish. Volunteers, they rebuild after hurricanes. Community kitchens, they hold families. And support networks, mutual connect neighbors. Today, Mexico writes his own final act, but the echo of its origins resonates with strength. Every step toward the future is marked by the legacy of warriors, astronomers, reformers, and visionaries who, with their memory, illuminated the path. Through millennia of splendor and adversity, Mexico has forged a unique soul, mestizo, brave, and creative. Its stones ancient and its modern skyscrapers tell the story of a people who, in the face of each challenge, reinvent themselves and embrace their identity. May this epic inspire us to look at the present with gratitude for the roots and with courage to build the tomorrow. Because, in the end, the greatness of a nation does not lie only in his past, but in the strength of their living stories in each one of us. Keep exploring this journey and discover as the heartbeat of Mexico continues writing verses of resistance and hope. Throughout this journey, the viewer has witnessed the greatness of empires that rose cities on the water, from cultures that deciphered the mysteries of the sky, and of people who fought for their freedom and its identity. Each episode has lit the spark of the curiosity and the pride in a legacy that, even today, it beats in every corner of Mexico. If you want to continue exploring these mysteries and discover new facets of our shared history, subscribe to the channel and activate the little bell so you don't get lost none episode. Share this documentary with who amen dive in epic tales and leave us your comment. Which part of this saga moved you the most? Your voice is what drives this project, and together we can bring the voices that the time almost made him silence. Thank you for joining us on this journey. See you soon, friends of the history. Never stop searching for the truth that lives in every stone and in every heart. See you in the next episode. Saubov!